Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the chance to rise tonight at adjournment proceedings to revisit a question I asked on November 20th, 2017. It was related to an event which has since passed, which was the Emmanuel Macron Climate Leaders Summit that was held in Paris. But let me move on to the point that I want to raise tonight, which relates to the Prime Minister's answer to me, which was entirely favourable. But what he said was, I know that by working together, we will achieve our international commitments as laid out in the Paris Agreement. And what I want to revisit this evening with the House is, what are we to understand are our international commitments as laid out in the Paris Agreement? Because what I find in the day-to-day press and conversations in this place is a conflating of the current target for carbon reductions that the Government of Canada is using as our current goal, as though it were absolutely consistent with the Paris Agreement. Now, of course, the current target to which the new Liberal government, not that new, but the Liberal government since 2015, has ascribed to the target of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And of course, the government knows well that that target predates the Paris Agreement being negotiated, because the Paris Agreement was negotiated in December of 2015, and this target is the Government of Canada's target from May 2015, was tabled by former Conservative Environment Minister Leona Aglukkaq, and it was at the time decried as one of the weakest targets in the industrialized world. In fact, our current Minister of Environment and Climate Change described it at one point as being the floor, and we'd certainly do better than that. It was less than 12 months later that the floor became the ceiling, and this is now our target. But to understand why it really matters to pay attention to the Paris Agreement, we have to look at where Canada did show leadership, and that was in advancing our target for all countries around globally. We must ensure that our reductions of greenhouse gases are sufficiently aggressive to hold global average temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and certainly below 2 degrees. But in looking at why 1.5 degrees matters, it matters critically and urgently, and I say this not in any way as an exaggeration or hyperbole. It matters for the survival of human civilization. It may even matter for the survival of the species that we achieve an equilibrium of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere such that we can adapt to those changes in climate change that we can no longer avoid. It's a question of odds. The odds matter. We're now in a game of almost like Russian roulette. If we lose 1.5 as our goal, if it goes to 2 or worse to 3 or 4, we are increasing the odds with every increase in global warming of catastrophic events such as, for instance, losing the Western Antarctic ice sheet. If we lose the Western Antarctic ice sheet because it sits on land instead of the melting ice in our Arctic, which doesn't affect sea level rise, if we lose the Western Antarctic ice sheet, that has an impact of 8-meter sea level rise in Canada. That's information from the University of Toronto study called the GRACE Project under Professor Dick Proctor. That's a huge impact. We have to do everything in our power to hold our temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Worse risks, of course, if we lose all the permafrost in our Arctic, if it all melts, that releases 4 times more greenhouse gases than everything since before the Industrial Revolution. That could affect human extinction. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Honourable Government to please consider what is our Paris target and how are we going to meet it.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member. I think, as the honourable member alluded to, the initial question actually related to the One World Summit, but the question is a little bit different, and I'm happy to address the question that the member has posed. This government was elected on a platform that included a significant commitment to addressing the issue of climate change. Many who ran for the Liberal Party, as ran for other parties, certainly the Green Party, did so in large measure because they were committed to addressing the issue of climate change. I, for one, ran in large measure because of a commitment about addressing climate change. Once elected, this government played a constructive role in the context of the development of the Paris Agreement. The honourable member was in Paris with the Minister of Environment and Climate Change for those conversations. And subsequent to that, we worked with the provinces and territories in the federal architecture that is Canada to come up with a plan that would allow us to have visibility about how we actually address this matter and meet the targets to which we had actually committed under the Paris Agreement. As the honourable member has mentioned, the target that was actually established had been established under the previous government, but the previous government had established a target with absolutely no plan in place to actually meet that target. And as the honourable member knows very well, many of the changes that are required for us to make substantive progress towards achieving emissions reductions require major changes in the way in which we actually conduct industrial practice, whether that's phasing out of coal, whether that's actually changing the nature of the transportation system to move to more electrified vehicles or other kinds of alternative vehicles, whether it's bringing in new building codes that actually over time will affect the energy efficiency of buildings, not just new buildings, but retrofits of existing buildings. Those are all things that actually take time to thoughtfully develop, and then they take time to thoughtfully implement. This government was in a position where it had 12 years to actually work through and implement a process that would allow us to have visibility on meeting our targets. This government is very much committed to addressing climate change. We are committed to achieving the targets that we established under Paris, and to the extent that we are making progress in that direction, we are open, as the minister has said on many occasions, to ratcheting up our level of ambition over time. But let's be clear. In Canada, governments have histories of establishing targets with absolutely no plan and no actions to meet those. This government has taken the exact opposite perspective, which is to say, we need a target, but we actually need a plan. We need to show Canadians that this is something that we actually can do, and that we work in stepwise to show progress on this critical issue, as the honourable member has talked about, that is something that is not only in the interests of Canadians, but is in the interests of all citizens of this planet.
Honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The critical question here is time. We heard the Parliamentary Secretary say the government may ratchet up our commitment over time. We're running out of time. That is our most precious and vanishing commodity. I've watched the debates on climate in this country over decades, and procrastination has been the order of the day. But it's not correct to say there was never a plan. The government of the Right Honourable Paul Martin had a plan that would have taken us very close to Kyoto. It was brought forward in 2005 and is replete with measures that the current government could implement. Things like eco-energy retrofit for housing, things like programs to encourage the purchase of vehicles, either electric vehicles or hybrids that are low-emission vehicles. We're not seeing this government even dust off the 2005 budget of a previous Liberal government that was very close to reaching Kyoto targets had not the Conservatives become elected and cancelled all those plans. So my point here, Mr. Speaker, is it's 2018. I still see no plan. I don't see a carbon budget, and I don't see the kind of action that is required.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with all due respect to my honourable colleague, I clearly have a different perspective on that. If one reads the Pan-Canadian framework, there are measures relating to the transition towards energy efficiency in vehicles, but also a longer-term transition towards low-emission or zero-emission vehicles. There are provisions relating to new building codes for new buildings, but also retrofit building codes to ensure that we actually are reducing the footprint that the GHG emission levels that come from buildings. There are provisions relating to the accelerated phase-out of coal. There are provisions relating to the development of a low-carbon fuel standard, which will lower the emissions intensity of the fuels that we're actually using. There are enormous numbers of measures that will help us on a stepwise way to get to our targets. There is clear visibility that is outlined in the Pan-Canadian framework as to how we will do that. This has never been done in terms of implementation of a climate plan in the history of Canada, and we will do it.